Today's technical webinar will be a continuation on the xAPI-focused webinar from December, xAPI Profile Server, Advancing Learning Interoperability Across Systems, which you can view at the link I've added to the chat window. If you missed that webinar, it's perfectly fine. Aaron Silvers will be running this webinar as more of a discussion around xAPI related things and answering more questions. So if you have any questions to ask, click on the questions panel in the GoToWebinar window and type your question there. The questions will pop up on the screen and the speakers will try their best to answer as many as possible in the allotted time. Without further ado, I'll let Aaron Silvers take it over. Aaron?
Thanks a lot, Liz, and hello everybody. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're calling from. This is going to be a bit of more talking and maybe even some discussion rather than presenting a lot of information. The last presentation that we did with y'all back in November, Jason Haig and I went through a lot of talking points around profiles and the history of profiles and how we are dealing with that, and talked to the development activities that are happening. Those development activities are still progressing, but we're reaching a point now where we can see on a horizon of within this year, we're going to have profile servers, at least a profile server for people to work with, if not several of them. We have a few profiles that clearly have been part of ADL's lexicon for the last 2 or 3 years, and that portfolio builds slowly over time. What we don't have, though, is a lot of dissemination of our best practices of how we are dealing with profiles. The discussions that have been coming up in some of the research and development that we've done with the community over the last couple of years, over the span of a couple of years, we're hitting this point where there's enough mess and enough questions that necessitate getting people together more often to talk about profiles, because they're linked to how we want to approach learning analytics. They're linked to how we may want to do machine learning applications down the road. They are linked to governing our quality of our data and ultimately how we make decisions. If we're going to make decisions based on the data that we're generating, we have to have reliability that the data is representing exactly what we think it's supposed to be representing. So what I'm going to do today is really kind of start making the case for, and I'd say first provoking the community towards certain types of questions that we just need to kind of start grappling with. And they're hard stuff, which is why I talk about these as use cases for hard stuff. So there are multiple questions baked within each of these topics. There are lots of ways in which rabbit holes that can be uncovered, and this is why, as I'm bringing this up to you, the action that's going to be taken at the end of this, not just the webinar, but as a result of me even talking with you all today, is that we're going to get a discussion group going within IEEE to talk about profiles and to codify some of what we put together in a couple of different outputs. We'll get to what that is down the road, but today I want to at least set the framing for the kind of discussions we need to have. So, not surprisingly, and this is something that we learned from the dissemination of xAPI, is that we need to establish, encourage, and distribute best practices. And we need to do that in a manner that is probably more organized than the sporadic, random droppings of golden nuggets that happen in different presentations here and there. It would be good if there was a community resource that actually had all this stuff, had a lot of these lessons learned put together. Now, this directly addresses, in one of the links that Liz shared in the chat window in the announcements, one of those links is around the recommendations that were made to ADL on behalf of, about creating xAPI profile servers. And one of the things that we addressed in that was that there are some risks to the success of profiles in general. And these risks, they start on page 16 of that document if you're really interested. I'm not going to read everything. I'm not going to read this to you, but basically, like, there are things like marketing and training that contribute to adoption, and we need to make those things available. At the same time, we need to have like practices established, in terms of how we set up profiles and how we support profiles going down the road, so that we can have an ecosystem where we are reusing profiles as best as we can. At the same time, recognize that when there is a need for new profiles, that we people gather together and the right people gather together and follow standard processes to get things out. And one of the things that we need to challenge ourselves on, and this is a trap that I've certainly found the work that we've been doing around the profile server development to be messy or confusing, is determining what is a best practice versus implementation guidance. And that already sounds like a war of like vocabulary terms or taxonomies or labels. But the idea being that, like, there are some things that everybody needs to do to make profiles work, or to make a specific profile work, and that really lends itself, I would say, to as like an instruction or an implementation guidance. Then there are practices that are probably generalized, that may be generalized for certain types of applications, or certain types of uses of profiles, or certain types of uses of learning activities even. And we need to understand what those best practices are that are different from the things you need to do to make the thing work. There's getting the things to work, and there are making things easier for yourself or for the learners or for analysts. And those are understanding, and how we label these things has a great deal of effect in how instructions get followed. If, for example, if we take an idea around, content packaging for launch, right? Depending on the type of profile you want to do, the approach that you want to take, whether it's the tin can launch or a CMI5 launch, or maybe you're still using SCORM and you're baking xAPI statements into that. There's a lot of different ways that you need to implement that content packaging to make it work. But there are best practices that are probably afforded in terms of like where you're placing a score, where you're placing a result, etc. And that some of that falls into implementation guidance, and some of that is less obvious because of the ways in which LRSs accept statements. And as profiles are new, there are things that probably don't get automatically caught when using profiles, and so we need to also understand what those best practices are. There is an idea that there may be interest in codifying types of xAPI profiles. If we look and survey what profiles people are using and people that are out there, we have profiles that talk a bit to modality, like more like a self-directed e-learning, versus performance support, right? Or desktop versus mobile. Okay? We have profiles that talk about media types, particularly like video and audio. But there's also an idea, and it's one that's particularly, I think, resonant with instructional designers and trainers, about establishing profiles around specific skill sets or specific job tasks or specific professions, right? I don't know. I don't have a stake in I don't have a particular stake in this. I have some educated guesses that I lead to in terms of what we should do, but it's not enough to base like a whole organizational system around yet. We need to understand how people want to use profiles, where we are, and particularly what kinds of value we want to get out of the use of xAPI in profiles to help us get there, so that we can start to understand maybe how we better organize certain types of profiles for certain types of groups to own and manage and maintain. And we can start to almost design the elaborate complexity that's going to happen around a proliferation of, proliferation of profiles. Didn't mean to do that, but that's there. That, address that and scale towards different domains, different professions, different media types, and the ways in which people in other groups may want to extend our work and build on top of it. Thinking these things through seems like pretty early, considering we don't have a lot of profiles and we don't have profile servers in our hands yet. But this is the type of thinking that we needed to do when xAPI was first introduced, so that we can kind of carve out the space in which it can grow, and we can now maybe better prepare ourselves as a community for getting up to speed with this and mastering it and disseminating this information better. There's the whole question of, once we have xAPI profiles servers, how are we going to manage and host these things? We're going to want to talk about how we want to federate and maybe connect these profile servers together. There has been, there's all sorts of questions that come around with that. It's one thing for an organization to manage and host their own profile server, where they're pointing, in future, they're pointing their development environments and their authoring tools and their analytic systems to these profile servers. But if we want to get the most value out of them, clearly there's ways in which some of us can imagine these profile servers exchanging information, making it possible for us to have no one single point of failure in a network that increasingly we imagine people are going to be building a lot more meaning atop of. So their persistence and how we connect them and how we protect, if we need to protect information from moving from one server to another, understanding the ways in which we want to connect these things or not connect these things are important conversations that we need to have. Then there's the idea of having a curated or verified set of xAPI profiles. Like, we want to encourage as many different profiles that need to be out there that address specific and unique needs. We want those available. But for a lot of folks, having just of all the different profiles that are available, knowing that there are a few that everybody uses, and that these things are, there are systems to help promote the use of specific profiles given, applications and contexts that are necessary. How do we do that? Who does that? Who's going to be responsible for maintaining that list? What is the process for getting something, verified? What does that even mean for it to be verified? That's all a huge rabbit hole of discussion that, again, a group needs to come together and do this, which we're going to do. Then there's the idea of setting expectations for xAPI profile contributors, right? What kinds of organizations or what kinds of entities own or or take responsibility for an xAPI profile, and what is expected of them in doing that? Because, again, as we start creating meaning and start building more systems that depend on the availability of these profiles, the questions of how they're connected to each other, these servers are connected to each other, the question of how people can access these things, and the need for their persistence, and the need for them to be maintained over time, because our use of language changes, our policies, our actions, the way in which we describe things over time changes, right? We need to have some expectations set so that we can, when we are inviting contributors into our broader community, that there are clear expectations of what they get out of it for doing it and what they need to do to be healthy and for us to have a healthy data environment. And then there's, again, the idea of maintaining and sunsetting xAPI profiles. At some point, some of these profiles may lose their utility. And depending on the choices that we make in terms of how things are connected and how things evolve and how things migrate, we need to be mindful about how often we're maintaining these profiles and how do we get ourselves off of one profile and onto another in a seamless transition, so that as new people are come on board, we're doing it as best as we can to get everybody doing what they should be doing at the time that they're getting, that's right for when they come on board. Now, I don't have a whole lot more to share. Now is a good time for us to, for some questions to be coming in. But if you want to get involved in these discussions, the dates and times of those meetings are still not set. But if you are interested in joining those discussions, please sign up at the IEEE P project 92741. That's the xAPI technical advisory group, and just sign up to register, and we'll, as our discussions get scheduled, there'll be an email blast that goes out to everybody who joins there, and we can start more formally organizing through there as a group.
Okay, well, we don't have any questions just yet, so send in your questions, go into the questions panel and go to webinar and type them in there. And maybe if you want to go back one slide so people can check out the bullet points to jog their memory.
Sure.
That might help. All right, can we see that one?
I can. Can SharePoint act as an xAPI profile server? I'm going to go with maybe, but doubtful. I'm sure that there are some things about serving profiles that SharePoint could probably do based on the spec, or at least can be extended to do. I think there's a few other things that we're building in that would be very difficult to replicate in SharePoint. That said, I would need to understand. I think we would all need to understand a bit more about what that would actually mean.
All right. Maybe they'll send in a follow-up question. But the next question from Europe: what are the places to find best practices currently?
Well, right now there isn't a one central place to find best practices, and especially around profiles. I would argue that there's, short of a handful of maybe some presentations from late last year, there's not been much put out on what to do with best practices. And now that said, I think that is one of the best things that we could do with a discussion group, is start assembling those best practices, as a community resource.
All right. Next question. What organizations have or are in process for setting up a profile server?
So to date, nobody has a profile server. We're still building it. There is a vocabulary server that has been hosted by ADL, which has been kind of like the model on which we evaluated and built on and then departed from a bit in terms of what the profile server has to do. And as far as I know, there are people who are actively at least referencing that vocabulary server. We expect that a lot of the services will set up one or multiple profile servers for themselves in time. I would guess that there are other U.S. government agencies that will be doing that as well for various needs, both in terms of as an internal service to other federal organizations, and then obviously for their own HR and training, performance analytics work among their own workforce. But that's all. Right now, there is no formal, like, we have a list of a waiting list of people who are just waiting to get their xAPI profile server. We're doing the due diligence right now to just get everything up and running. So.
All right. Have you seen / heard any interest / involvement / awareness from any of the xAPI tool vendors yet?
Yes. I'm again not going to cite names, but there are a few authoring tool vendors. There are a few, more than a few LRS vendors and learning management system, a couple of learning management system entities that are very interested in making sure that profiles are a success. They see the utility of it and the opportunity therein to really solve a lot of interoperability challenges that come with trying to interpret data. So we have their interest, and as we're getting this group spun up, they're going to be involved. I'm going to guess they're going to be involved in the same group as well. And as we get into beta testing and things like that for a profile server, they'll be involved.
Okay. Next, if training mediums send data without adhering to xAPI profiles defined already, those xAPI statements get rejected. We lose data. How to avoid this? How do we?
What? So I'm going to try and maybe reinterpret that question and hopefully get it right. If I have training content, I have training applications that are sending xAPI data today, and they're sending it to an LRS. If those statements are valid, they're not getting rejected. Now, if they are not following profiles because those profiles don't exist today, that's one thing. But really, when these statements are replaced or asserted that there are other concepts, other things that would make meaning, we can at the same time take a look at what those statements are and make assertions that these statements that are recorded in the back should also be equivalent to this new statement now. Right? We're not there yet, but I don't think you're going to lose data in the transition between not using profiles to using profiles. You may evaluate it, and this is probably something that we will vet out through in discussions of what are best practices for even analyzing data, that if you are making changes to your profile, you may want to analyze these things in blocks. And there are equivalencies that we can set up, but we're one, it's all new, and two, we're still working through the mechanics of just making sure that the data we send is correct, and what we do with it and how we reconcile with previous iterations of equivalent data. It's going to make for a really interesting discussion, but I do not think you're going to lose data in that.
All right, next question. What are the considerations for intellectual property if shared profiles exist? Then how does this work with GS-related training needing to be housed on onshore servers?
I'm unpacking that question for a second. considerations for intellectual property of shared profiles exist. So the first half of this question, I'd say, is kind of falls under the greater discussion of what is the role of a contributor to a profile, and what are the expectations of them. I don't have an answer for that right now, but I do think that the answer in terms of how we consider intellectual property is likely to be found in understanding what the relationship is, what the expectations are of someone who's of an entity that is taking responsibility for a profile. And I would say that how does this work with GS-related training needing to be housed on onshore servers? Trying to understand that question, and I don't know that I understand it.
Great. I'll keep an eye out for a follow-up if they want to clarify. All right. You want to move on? Move on.
Sure.
All right. Do you have any metrics on who is using and or any success stories?
No, we're too early for that. We don't have a lot of metrics on who is using profiles. I think Rusty Software at DevLearn in 2019, as part of their presentation, had some stats on how much data is relying on profiles of any kind, and that probably also heavily counts CMI5. So I think there are probably guesses that we can make around who's using profiles now, even when there's no validation mechanism for them or any major tangible benefit that anybody's immediately seeing from the use. So no, I don't have any of those metrics or any of those success stories yet.
All right. Well, we will have them one day.
We will.
All right. Next question. I have seen xAPI usage from LMS to LRS, seeing development of simulators to LRS. How much of implementation have you seen of xAPI outside of the computer, tablet, screen, real-world training activities? Is one of xAPI's purposes to collect data from real-world training?
Well, yes, in short order. Yes to a couple of those things. One is that, at least in terms of you're never really getting away much from some kind of screen with using xAPI because it is a digital construct. There clearly have been some, at least, proofs of concept and let's say prototype developments of people using sensors and things like that to automate generation of xAPI statements for whatever context they're doing. And certainly we've seen things in terms of like smart riflery, rifle ranges where the targets are able to send statements based on where there's an impact, etc. But more often what I'm seeing in the real world are observation and like personal observation apps where you have an instructor or you have a nurse preceptor or you have a manager who is observing or somebody practicing a skill, and they are making an evaluation, it's some kind of annotation about the performance of that skill, so that there's a link between a skill that is practiced in a simulator or online or with a chatbot or something like that, and observation of the skill being by a human who is in a position to actually objectively, or at least subject matter wise, is able to evaluate the performance of others. And that's more often what I see in the real world in terms of like how xAPI is being used to kind of triangulate the performance, like how people are actually performing.
Okay, all right, ready for the next question?
Sure.
All right, this was about the last webinar. In part one, you did mention 2 big name vendors that had not yet expressed interest. Are they among those that have expressed interest now?
I don't even remember who the 2 big name vendors that I were talking about back then were. So my guess is that it's either yes or no.
Okay. All right, maybe we can get back to that person who asked that question afterwards. We have a list of all of these questions, and I'll give them to Mr. Silvers so he can go through them. All right.
My pad?
Oh, sorry. Okay, ready? And what if a statement follows 2 profiles? For example, a video launched with CMI5 could follow both.
Yes, it could.
All right. Anything else on that?
That's all
Okay.
I got to say about that one.
Okay. Is there a resource available where one could browse through some use cases, which I feel like maybe we touched on earlier and answered that one, but
Well, so there are a number of, I would say the greater context for a lot of the decisions we're making, again, are in that DTIC document, the recommendations for xAPI profile servers that were made to ADL in 2018. There'll be a lot of use cases there if you're in terms of like what problem spaces we're really trying to address and how we're going about it. That's Now, if you're looking for other types of use cases, I would need to know what other types of use cases you're looking.
okay. This one is more of a statement, I think. But if you have any comments on it, this listener says U.S. government training needs to be located on servers within the continental U.S. based on contract requirements with the U.S. government.
You're right. So, all right. So I think this goes back to the question around the GS content on GS servers seem to be onshore. I think that this is probably a good use case for like feeding the discussions around how profile servers need to be able to federate, because yeah, even if these even if the training itself is on onshore servers, if they're being validated by links to control documents that are housed outside the U.S., it's probably a problem. In fact, if they're outside the firewall, it's probably a problem. I would guess that, like, for a lot of, if there was any kind of use of Google Analytics and stuff like that, any of those libraries need to still be within the unprotected space of where the content is, where the media itself is being served. So having local, or at least local enough, sources for the, if you want to think about like these profiles as like schema, that probably is important. And that's something that we're going to need to discuss.
Okay. I have 2 comments from a previous question. The previous question was the if training mediums one at the top there. But they followed up and they said they're not rejected by Learning Locker, but they do not adhere to xAPI profiles. And then we are evaluating with xAPI profiles and rejecting even then their valid xAPI statements. Do you have any comments on that?
Only that I want to talk to this person sometime in the future so we can understand what's going on.
Okay, well then we will
clearly present some interesting use cases right there. So,
okay, I think our questions have slowed down a bit. I'll put it up on the screen. This person says, "How do we get started with xAPI?" Do you have any good tips on that?
How to get started with xAPI?
Yep.
I would probably I'd probably look into when the next cohort is being hosted by Torrance Learning. That's probably a very good on-ramp to start.
The next cohort where?
With Torrance Learning, Megan Torrance has been taking on design cohorts where she gets people together from around the world, and I think they have about 150 in this last cohort. And you work on a team on sample project, like a getting started project.
Is there any link or anything to, or where to be able to set up?
I don't have a link for that, but if you Google xAPI cohort torrents, Megan Torrents, you'll find it.
Oh, okay. All right, cool. Just checking. Okay. Oh. All right, and I think that is it for us. Did you have anything else you wanted to say, Aaron?
No, like I said, sign up on the IEEE page. There'll be an email blast when we get our discussion group going. And thank you all for your time.
Yep. Okay. All right. Well, that's it. I don't have anything else to plug for you all today, but thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Aaron.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody.